Hello and welcome to It Started With a Kick, the podcast in which well-known fans and high-profile figures from the world of football talk to us about the first ever match they attended. I'm your host, Richard Foster, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce today's guest, Seb Hutchinson. Seb started his broadcasting career as a producer before making the big move into the commentary box, where he's covered both men's and women's World Cups, as well as the Euros for ITV. He currently commentates on the Premier League for Sky, and he'll be heading to Germany this summer for the Euros with the ITV commentary team. So, a very warm welcome, Seb.
Thanks for having me on, Richard.
Absolutely perfect. Interesting enough, your most recent commentary, I mean, we're recording this in early March, your most recent commentary was Sheffield United's shellacking at the hands of Arsenal. And by strange coincidence, your first match was also an away game for the Gunners, which didn't go quite so well for them. Tell us a bit about it.
So I'll take you back, or some people back. There's a lot of people listening who probably weren't born then, but and I can't believe I'm saying that at my age. I'm not even that old. But 1995, I think around April, um, West London, Loftus Road. It was called Loftus Road then. It's had a name change recently, but it was Loftus Road then. And Queen's Park Rangers hosting Arsenal, 3-1 winners on the day. And they completed the double over the Gunners in that year as well. Now, you might see that might seem strange, and it was strange, but QPR were the best performing London team in that season in the Premiership. And it, even though I say that now, I mean, QPR supporters might hark back to those days and everything else, but it was also strange for Arsenal, where they ended up finishing in the league that season. In the lower half of the table, 12th it was, and it's their lowest Premier League finish to date still. But you might think they were off the pace and they improved from there, but they were league champions not that long before then. So they had dropped off under George Graham, who ultimately paid the price in that season. And for Queen's Park Rangers, those were, strangely, heady days relatively. They were their best, that was their best Premier League performance. And since then, the club has had ups and downs in that period. And at the moment, they're battling just to stay in the championship. So things can change so quickly in football, but that was also a long time ago.
Yes, we do go backwards, don't we? Interestingly to say, they did the double over Arsenal. They beat them 3-1 at Highbury as well on New Year's Eve in that season. And, I did check this. Apparently, that's their joint biggest victory over Arsenal in 53 matches. So obviously a golden period for QPR, beating them twice, Arsenal twice in that period. And going back to the game specifically, can you remember some of the individuals and some of the incidents, let's say, from the game?
Well, on the day, I always remember, and it's straight, you have a nostalgia about that time period. And to me, two players stood out from that game, Andy Impey and Kevin Gallen. And it was fascinating because as I reflect back on that game, Kevin Gallen seemed older than he was. I think at the time he must have been 19, 20, but at the time he
Mm.
felt a lot older, and that's because I was only about 10 or 11. And to me, it's a strange sort of feeling because nowadays we'd be thinking about that, the young player breaking through. But to me, he felt like an established big name because you have no real perspective on where players sit. You're going off this one match while you're attending it. And he felt like a huge player at the time. And I say it, that game was a trigger for me to really become quite geeky about football. Before then, I had not a passing interest. I had an interest, but it was more in sport in general. But that year, 1995, really cemented my love of the game. As strange as it seems, a random situation, but I think that game really played a part in it because when you attend your first football match, it has a connection with you. It stays in your memory. Actually, whether you like football or not. I mean, my wife went to watch Brentford during the time when we were at university together, and she has no interest really in football at all. But she always remembers that game. She remembers it was Brentford against Sheffield Wednesday, Griffin Park, and she was there with her friend, and they were there to do it. They were studying drama, and they were there to document football fans. And I thought that must have been quite the
Oh my word.
experience for you.
Yes.
But these things stick with you at the time, and there were memories from that day that I won't really ever forget. And I think it's also it can be subtle things. It can be the clash of kit colors. Now, I haven't got a great memory when it comes to remembering sponsors on shirts and things like that. Actually, my friends laugh at me about it whenever we're doing football quizzes. Think we'll get Seb on shirt sponsors. That's the thing he never remembers. And I don't know why. Maybe it's like an anti-corporate thing, but I don't know. But I always, but that red and white and that blue and white, to me, as a contrast, just worked really well together. Just in my
Mhm.
head, just nostalgically. I can't really say why. I mean, I always like seeing a red and a blue as a commentator as contrasting colours. They just work really well. A rich red and a rich blue, but a little bit of white as well. It just seems to work quite nicely. And I know that might sound strange to some people, but it's just a subtle thing. I'm quite a tactile person. And that really stood out to me. Also, the gait of players during the game. I always remember Andy Impey had his shoulders were quite hunched, and he had a gait in the way he ran with the ball. And I'll never forget that. And what's weird about that, in that context, I remember thinking that QPR are really, really good. And you forget about the Arsenal players involved in that season. We're talking about legends of the club. But yet, in that game, it was more of the QPR players that stood out. I remember Gary Penrice. I think he came off the bench, and I remember his moustache. And obviously, no surprise, I did not have a moustache at that age. But there's something about the memory of a guy playing football with a thick moustache just stuck with me. And it's those in terms of the goals and things like that, I don't really remember the goals too much. I remember, I think, Revett crossing it in from the left. Maybe I might have got it wrong and it bounced around. But I remember Tony Adams got a goal late on because talking about players' gates as well. I always remember Tony Adams' really upright stance to him. Tall guy, but his stance was very tall as well. And I think that can make someone even more imposing. And I always remember him at the back and his stride and the way he moved around the pitch. And as a commentator now, I sometimes like to see the way players move to help me, identify them quickly, more than numbers half the time, straight away. Even, just say use Haaland as an example. If you completely just turned him into a pencil drawing with no color on anything else and just the silhouette of him moving around, you would know it was him. And
Absolutely, yeah.
absolutely. And Tony Adams had that about him as well. And Impey.
Yeah, so actually, I dipped into this is recent enough to dip into the video, and I watched. It's just pretty much just the goals. But you mentioned Tony Adams, so he scored, I believe, in the 89th or the 90th minute. I have never seen more of a consolation goal in my life. In that he scored and he did that trotting back to the halfway line, grim faced, just get on with it. We want to get off this pitch. We've had enough of this. Da, 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 da. And I've never seen anyone, I mean, lots of players score consolation goals, but he was just not having any joy. That was nothing to do with it. And Impey is also stands out because any of the highlights, he is running the show. And I'm sure you wouldn't stoop this low as a commentator, but I would have called him the impish Impey. But, that's why I'm
Yeah.
not a commentator, Seth. That's why I'm not a commentator.
An open goal for you there. And I think, Les Ferdinand played in that game. Trevor Sinclair. We're talking about
Yeah,
players well, Les Ferdinand was a great player at the time. And I think that was his last QPR season, effectively. But even if you're to reel through that QPR side, there are names in there that people will know, and you think, oh, right, they were a good player. And I'm pretty sure Ian Holloway was in that team as well, and obviously
he
went on
was.
to
Yeah,
be a notable manager. But I'm trying to think of this game more about what I remember on the day, and Impey stood out massively on the day. Sinclair was like a tricky winger, and his hair as well, and everything about the way he moved. The hair would move as he moved, and these are the things as a kid that stick with you. And also, every goal and every moment even though I can't remember the goals themselves, the feeling, that rush when the crowd cheers the goal, and the mood of the game always sticks with you, because it's that thing you can't explain to people when you say why you like football, because people do have different reasons. But to me, football has always affected me quite emotionally in terms of, and that's quite useful as a commentator to an extent. But when I think of, England going out of tournaments, especially when, not as much now, obviously, as an adult, but when you were younger, it really affected me at the time. I remember telling Gareth Southgate, having worked with him at ITV, you're responsible for one of the times I cried at football. And he
I
said,
bet
"Oh,
that
thanks
made
very
him
much."
feel really good. Yeah.
Yeah, he said, "Oh, thanks very much. Cheers, Seb." But it was meant to be just to show how important football is to people. And sometimes I don't know if footballers now would understand that per se while they're in the professional game and doing their job. But it changes how people not only view that day, but even the months ahead, and it shouldn't really be like that. It doesn't make any sense. There's people you don't really know too well affecting your day, but it's just part of the human condition, I guess.
Absolutely. And as you say, the details are often a bit hazy, but it's more the mood. Can you remember whereabouts on the ground you were? Because, obviously, in those days,
Oh
there
yeah,
was what we call terracing.
yes, yeah,
And,
yeah.
you've got the Ellerslie Road stand, you've got South Africa stand, and then you've got the loft, which is where generally
Mm.
the noisier elements of the
So
QPR fans are.
I was thinking about that ahead of this, and I did think maybe it was South Africa, because I felt I was low down, that I knew,
Mhm.
and I was sort of in the corner, um, behind the goal, but I may have been to the side. But at that age, I was thinking this when I've been to QPR since, and thinking, where was it? Was I ever in that corner? Was I in that corner? And I don't. I know it sounds crazy to think, but I don't have a real concept of where I sat in the ground. And a big part of that is because when I was a kid, and to give a build up to the game, I'm sure you're going to ask me anyway, but I'll go into that. So my parents had broken up just under a year before that game, and me, my sister, and my mum moved to West London, hence why QPR and their ground was close to there. And my mum had no interest in football at all, and we didn't really have much money. But there was a youth centre that I went to a few times, literally around the corner. We was in the Ladbroke Grove area, and we'd go to this youth centre sometimes. They were teaching us how to play steel drums. It was around the year I went to the Notting Hill Carnival that year. I say I went to it. It was on our doorstep. I remember finding it quite intense because, again, you're only 10, 11 at the time, and these grown men are sort of shouting up and down, blowing whistles. But it was intoxicating as well. You felt like you wanted to be part of it and wanted to be in it, but I was obviously too young to be involved. But it passed along our road that we were on. Um, but to go back to the youth centre, there was a guy there, and he basically said, "Oh, I'll take a group of you to QPR to watch the game as a thing, really." And people look at it nowadays and saying, "Oh, that's a bit strange," and everything else. But that wasn't the case at the time. That's how youth centres worked. You sort of, and I'm sure he told my mum. I remember thinking I didn't want to tell my mum because she probably wouldn't let me go, which is bad. She would have definitely let me go. But it felt like a day out, and we walked there to the ground. Now I think again, I think there's Wood Lane Tube Station is in that area now. That didn't exist then. It was added. I think it was one of the tube stations to be added on an existing line for 70 years or something. But it wasn't. It didn't exist then. That tube station. We walked to the ground. It must have been. It probably takes about half an hour, but it
Mhm.
felt like part of the day, walking there and moving in with a crowd and seeing people move. And I'm sure some people had whistles in that crowd as well. I'm pretty sure of that.
Maybe they
But
were sort of referees just sort of strolling
yeah,
along and
yeah,
they had the whistle.
yeah, possibly. Uh, but that game, I didn't go and attend another football match for probably about, gosh, 4 years after that. And
Oh,
again,
really?
when I next started going, it was again just another adult just taking me there, independent of a family, as like a favor type thing. Um, we had a guy I knew he was a Swiss guy who had come to London, and he was a lawyer practicing, and he basically took us to. He was a massive Arsenal fan, and he wanted to take me to some games. And Arsenal were playing at Wembley in the Champions League. This is late '90s, and he took me to the Fiorentina game, Barcelona game, I believe, and yeah, Dynamo Kiev.
Right.
And I again have memories of those games. I was at the end where Batistuta smashed the ball past David Seaman. It's one of the hardest shots I've seen to this day. It's an unbelievable finish. I've seen Barcelona just wipe the floor with Arsenal. Incredible team. I think Figo was playing in that team. But again, you're behind the goal and you're just seeing these patterns and players moving around the pitch, and you're thinking they're on another level. And this is an Arsenal side who were champions, obviously, at the time. And then the Dynamo Kiev side had Shevchenko in it, and it was the one that had Rebrov and Shevchenko up front that got to the semi-finals, and quite a legendary team in Ukraine at that time, and in football as well, because of the Lobanovsky tactical evolution and everything else. But that's why people might ask, that game at Loftus Road, can't you remember what seat you're in? Can't you remember this? Can't you remember that? But my consumption of football was through telly. That's what it was. And also through these things they were football figurines made by Corinthians, big-headed football figures. And I first got into collecting them maybe 94, I think around that time. And I had, hundreds and hundreds of them by the end. And I used to use them. They were some of my first ideas of thinking how I was going to commentate on games. Because I've said this so many times, but again, 1995, around the time, was about the time when I really wanted to be a commentator.
Yeah, so that's instilled in you at an early age. I must admit, I'm of an age where Corinthians didn't really cross my path. I'm more a Soccer Stars man, and we used to have those little coins you get from petrol stations. But as I say, that slightly puts me in a different generation. But talking about the commentating as well, so you always maintained that you, from a very early age, wanted to be a commentator. So when you started going to games, so for example, let's say your first game, QPR Arsenal, in the back of your head, were you doing a bit of commentating? What was going on, or was that something that came a bit later?
No, so that certainly would have come in subsequent games, but that first game, it wasn't quite nailed in. I wanted to do, but I remember wanting to consume football media. So this thing, when you don't go to games, you're not able to go to games, can't afford to, you don't have a relative to take you. You consume the media, and you consume Match of the Day, ITV Champions League games. ITV had, I think they had League Cup then as well, FA Cup. Every piece of free-to-air telly at the time, I was consuming all of it. And you get to know the presenters, the commentators, the pundits, the practitioners involved in broadcasting football. I did actually listen to a lot of radio at the time as well. Particularly, even though I listened to Five Live a bit, I used to always listen to Capital Gold, because it was a very London-based radio station. And Jonathan Pearce, who I've worked alongside many a time.
Yeah.
I haven't told him this yet, but I remember wanting to just phone up to talk about the back. I wanted to talk about the back three. I was basically saying that why don't more clubs use the back three in England? Why do so many clubs in England use 4-4-2, and yet Glenn Hoddle was starting to use it with the England team, and that's it's another example. You're starting to note tactically things are going on, and I did have a tactical eye because my dad was a football coach, And even though my parents are split up, his influence in that regard was still strong. And you learn to look at the game a bit differently. I mean, I used to, Football Italia on Channel 4, I used to watch that. Any international tournament I was crazy about. The 98 World Cup, I actually did a full-on, in-depth wall chart with every scorer and every player assisting the goal. And I think it is somewhere. I think I still have that. Maybe I'm going a bit far with assists. I don't think they were a thing then, but certainly the goal
You didn't
scorers.
have XG, did you? You didn't have
I
XG
didn't
on
have
that chart.
XG or field tilts or anything like that. I just had who scored, the countries playing. I was really, and that's the other thing with football. It teaches you a lot about geography. And to go back to the commentary situation, the thing that really triggered me was in 1995 there wasn't an international football tournament, but there was the Rugby World Cup, both union and league, and I got really involved in those two tournaments. I learned so much about geography that I didn't know before. I remember thinking, Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, they were playing in the Rugby World Cup.
Right.
And I knew, because of where I live, I knew people who had family from all parts of the world, but that was one place I didn't know anybody was from. So then I was really interested, looked into the squad of the team, and I remember there was a player who had a really bad injury in the group stage. And that really stuck with me. I felt emotionally really sad about that. And I also remember thinking, I don't want to play rugby. I do not want to play any rugby because, especially you see people like Jonah Loma around, standing an amazing figure. Remember Rob Andrews dropped goal against Australia, but it wasn't so much what the athletes were doing. It was more the coverage of it. And I had such a strong attachment to how people would cover a moment and the emotion of it. Not necessarily the words, but just how they said the words. And that's why I've always said I particularly loved Brian Moore at the time and David Coleman in athletics, because there was just that, the gravitas was there, but just a little bit of emotion, a little tweak in the voice when the moment required, just to make you feel this is important or this means something.
Yeah. And 1995, as we've discussed before, was also a big year for boxing, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, because I always say my first sporting memory was Frank Bruno losing to Mike Tyson in the late 80s. But Frank Bruno won the world title that year. And again, you feel like you know these people intimately. You feel like, oh, good on you, Frank. That was brilliant. So pleased for him. He felt like one of your family. And I felt quite patriotic as well. And I think sport made that happen. I think, oh, this is good. This is brilliant for British boxing. They got, Frank Bruno's won a world title because Lennox Lewis had been shocked in the match before, in the bout before.
Mm-hmm.
And in a weird way, that again opened the door for Frank because he'd lost to Lennox earlier on. And again, I'd followed Frank Bruno's journey in that I always felt it was like he was always, in my eyes, winning on points in matches, and then he'd tire out and then get stopped. And it was always so agonizing. I found it really upsetting. But that one, he hung on at the end and he was declared champion. All the emotions, it was a really raw, emotional moment. But unfortunately for Frank, quite soon after that, his first defense, I think, was against Mike Tyson coming out of prison. So, and I remember before that, I gave Frank absolutely no hope. So when he did get stopped relatively early in that fight, it wasn't quite as bad as before because it was Mike Tyson.
Yeah, you prepared yourself for it, haven't you? Really, and as you say, fresh out of prison, he was ready to go. So that's sort of almost like an epiphany for you, that 95. But let's move back from world title fights back to Loftus Road and the game. Is you're quite right that Impey. Not only was he running the show, but also he scored the first goal, which was actually Brevitt crossed it over from the left. Les Ferdinand on the far post imperiously headed it back, and actually a really smart finish by Impey. So, as you said, Ferdinand's in there, and then Gallen scores the second goal, set up by Trevor Sinclair. That was actually Gallen's first season. He was just 19, and he became a club legend. He had two spells there. He scored over 90 goals, and it's quite nice when you look back. Obviously, you don't realise when you're a 10-year-old in the crowd, but it's quite nice that you saw Kevin Gallen in his first season scoring a goal, and you just think, oh, I now can connect with him. And to say he had a great career. He moved away, and then he came back, and lots of QPR fans, I'm sure, put Gallen, if not at the top, pretty close to the podium. Unfortunately, we lost Stan Bowles recently. Stan Bowles is classic QPR legend, brilliant player, maverick. The usual issues, but what a fantastic player, and everyone spoke about him, said this guy is class. So the fact that you saw Gallen score, as I said, and then I think the third goal is the one that struck me, and that you probably won't have any memory of it, but a guy called Carl Reddy, who
Yeah,
was a centre back,
had blonde hair.
not
There's blonde hair, wasn't
blonde, yeah, very
it? Yeah,
blonde,
yeah, yeah.
and he did a sort of amazing dribble. Not quite sure where it came from. Gave it to your man Penrice, the guy with the
Hmm.
moustache. He hit the post, and then Reddy followed it up. Reddy didn't score that many goals, and again, if I was a commentator, I'd be going, "Ready, steady, go." But again, we're not going to go down that road.
Yeah.
You can see where my latent talent lies. Um,
Well, some people
so
might say reedy, wouldn't they? That's the thing with
Yes,
that word.
indeed. Oh God, let's not go into pronunciations. That would be mad. So yeah, QPR, ended that season eighth, and they were, relatively comfortable. The first season of the Premier League, they'd actually finished fifth. Top London club. And when you look at it, the first three seasons, they were the best London club because they finished in the top 10 every time. Arsenal didn't do that. Tottenham didn't do that. Chelsea didn't do that. So, top London club for the first 3 years, well established. And then, unfortunately for QPR, it went sour because the next season they went down. And also in that season, you've got to reflect, Arsenal, were they really in trouble? Yes, they were. Because four clubs went down that season because they were reducing it from 22 to 20. So, at the time, Arsenal were only 5 points above the relegation zone. And I talk about the four relegation places with a certain amount of bitterness because guess who the team was who went down, who
Oh,
were fourth and bottom? Yeah, Palace on 45 points. And I won't mention the 49 points we got in the first season. I've still got relegated. I'm not saying there's conspiracy, but that whole thing about QPR, top team, the best London team, clearly for those 3 years. Did you? It's interesting you say that then you had a 4 year gap. Was there not a temptation to think, oh, I'd love to go and do that again? And as you
oh,
say, you're only half an hour walk away.
100%, 100%. But the problem is you have to find somebody to go with, considering your age. And my mum didn't want me going out on my own and in London or whatever. So, and I respected my mum enough not to just try and sneak out the door, but I was desperate. I was so wanted to be involved. I remember in Euro '96 and it being in England, and I thought, oh, if there was only a way I could get to one of these games, um, and it didn't happen. And you just feel like, oh, did I just miss out? Did I just, and it's weird now. Obviously, you're going to stadiums every single week, and I appreciate it every single time because I think it is, you can use the word privilege in different ways, but it's a privilege to do the job that I do. But it also, when you see kids at the ground and you think they're being taken there with their families, and you think to have this experience is a special one, and cherish it, and suck in all those swear words from the crowd and all these new words that you're learning.
Yeah,
And that's when covering women's football as well. That's another side of it, is that it is a family friendly environment, and a lot of people see the pros and cons in that. But again, you are still bringing people into the football sphere, and that's what's so great about the game. And different grounds, you have different feelings. And I think back to that season. Even though you had really good sides in England, obviously, and Manchester United were one of the top teams, and Blackburn won the league that season and everything, it did feel like anything could happen in any match. and shocks happened more, and teams dropped points more. That's what it felt like at the time. And I think in that season, I think Arsenal got knocked out by Millwall in the FA Cup.
That's right.
Um, but yeah, this is an Arsenal side finishing 12th that went on to Cup Winners' Cup final again.
Yeah.
And the famous Naeem goal in the last seconds of extra time.
Yeah.
But again, that's the influence of those sort of moments. Being in London, I remember going to school, and people were pretending to be these players, pretending to be Naeem and trying to lob someone from the halfway line. Tony Yeboah scored 2 goals coming down off the crossbar, legendary goals, really. His greatest moments. It's amazing how these few moments can just be notched in people's memories, and people trying to recreate these situations. Football can give you a tendency to go off topic, and that's exactly what I'm doing now.
Well, we like the odd tributary. It's fine. And actually, going back to the match reports, because that's a nice way of reminding yourself what happened. And just like to say thanks to Chris Guy, who's the historian at QPR, who helped me out here. So he dug out some match reports, and you mentioned swearing. Interestingly, he said in one of the match reports, they were talking about the headline was Arsenal facing the drop. And in the match report, they quoted an Arsenal chant that was coming from the away end, which was "We're shit and we know we are," which it's always a catchy one, isn't it? We love the swearing, we love the issues, but it again on the video, and you get the commentary after, I think it's Reddy's third goal. They say Arsenal fans leaving in droves, and in one of the match reports, it said David Dean, who was chairman at the time, apparently he didn't hang around after that game. He was out of there. And the other thing that struck me when I was researching the game is that the manager of QPR was Ray Wilkins, who being the player manager, and he wasn't playing at the time, but he was highly regarded. And in fact, in some of the stuff, and fortunately for you, I found you the programme from this game. So we're going to get that to you as a thank you and as a memoir for that game. The chairman, who I don't really remember him at all. You didn't used to remember chairman, do you? They used to be pretty anonymous. In his notes, this is the headline: "Don't believe everything you read." I'm just going to quote it. "When David slew Goliath, there were probably ancient scribes speculating the day afterwards that he would soon be joining the Philistines in a surprise move." Now, I'm not sure how many QPR fans were au fait with the Bible, but let's run with it. He basically is complaining about the fact that there was a rumour that Ray Wilkins was possibly being lured by Arsenal to become their manager. As you say, George Graham, he'd left a couple of months before under a cloud because of the bribery issues. And he goes on to say, I've got one message for you all. The only thing you should believe in the papers is the date, and you should check that twice. So he didn't hang about, this guy. His name actually was Peter Ellis.
Oh,
no, it's Peter Ellis. Yeah, Thompson came in a bit later, I think. So I love looking at programmes because it brings out this is 1995. I can't imagine a current day chairman laying into the press, and literally his whole column is saying they're all charlatans, they're making it up. But going back to Ray Wilkins, he never really made it as a manager. And this was probably the apogee of his managerial career, because QPR were doing well. He was there. Within a year, he'd gone. So the Arsenal manager was Stuart Houston, was a caretaker because he'd taken over from Graham when he was ousted. So again, when you go into your first games, I don't think managers really have much impact on you. You don't remember the managers, whereas now they're a much bigger thing. Do you see that contrast from where you sit?
I think if you're going to games, the presence of the manager feels less important, really. But from a media sense, the manager's always there because during the coverage, you're always cutting to their face and seeing their reaction and everything, for goals and missed chances, whatever it might be. But when you're in the ground, you only tend to look towards where the manager is when there's a really controversial incident and you can see them remonstrating with the fourth official or something.
Yeah.
That's when you look across, and then the crowd feeds off that and jumps on that as well. I do remember around that sort of time, because those figures are, like, you do never forget those figures. And both clubs, as you say, had a crossover of manager in this time.
Mm.
And so Jerry Francis was always a figure I remember with QPR. And interestingly enough, I haven't mentioned this already, but when I moved to West London, when I started secondary school, I changed secondary schools in about year 9, and I moved to school in West London, Twyford, which is where QPR trained. And the time I was there, they were training on the school field. I think Wasps Rugby Club would come as well. And I always found that interesting. And of course, Kevin Gallen was still there by the time, because he
Yeah.
was a period of time. And even then, I do remember thinking at the time, you just had the feeling, is how old is this guy now? Because I remember him before. Because you have to remember how old you are. You are not,
Yeah.
I'm trying to think when that would be, 15, 16 or whatever. And somebody who's in their early 20s seemed really old to you.
Mhm.
So every footballer seemed really old. Don't get me started on the rugby players, because they were different species to you at that age. Because I think Lawrence Dallaglio was at Wasps at that time. I remember seeing him in the Tesco's and thinking, this guy is absolutely huge. And the footballers would walk in, and they felt more our height, weirdly. I think Richard Langley was there at the time, right at the end when I was about to leave. Um, yeah, it's yeah, interesting times.
Yeah, well, strange connection that we have there, Seb, because my son went to Twyford and he avoided playing rugby as well. So he was always trying to, you know, he was never going to make it with the big guys. So he decided to stick with football. So yeah, that the West London thing is interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at QPR, they have got a lot of rival clubs very close to
Mm.
them. So Chelsea, Fulham, Brentford, and as we alluded to, early 90s, QPR were the leading London club without a doubt. Now, not so much. So, having been overtaken by Brentford now must really hurt. Um, so, as you say, you had a 4-year gap, and then you were consuming everything you could on television and everything, through setting up your Corinthians in the right way. But did you have any heroes or villains? That I'm assuming Gallen was a bit of a hero to you, and maybe Impey. But were there any others that were, as you were really getting into the football, as you were becoming the football geek,
You
were
would
there
have,
players?
yeah. Look, the thing about it is that as I said, I consumed so much football at the time, and you'd have see snippets of players, foreign players particularly, and whenever you saw them, they looked amazing. And I always remember a player who stood out for me at that time, especially getting towards the late 90s, was Rivaldo. Rivaldo to me seemed like he'd been sent down from another planet. A footballer, he had a unique look. I didn't know anybody who looked like Rivaldo. Strange
Yeah.
as it might seem. Tall figure, had going back to that gait again, and I think Zidane has an element of that as well. They're tall, but they look strong and fearsome, but their technique is off the chain. I was remember watching him doing, thinking, how is somebody of this height able to score bicycle kicks and scissor kicks and come up with all of this? Because I always associated that sort of athleticism with smaller players. Um, I mean, there is when you think of the Premier League at that time, Dennis Bergkamp was a tall figure who had great technique, and he falls into that category. But I would say, yeah, Rivaldo was an interesting one. He just had, because I wasn't watching Spanish football, domestic matches. You just see him in the Champions League, and it's just incredible. I just think, who are these players? Like, why don't we get to see more of them? And then a World Cup would come along, the '98 World Cup, and that Brazil team in that tournament as well. I thought they were amazing in the lead up to it. Everyone remembers Roberto Carlos's free kick. It's just things you didn't feel like you'd seen. There was another player, Branco, who was scoring amazing free kicks from distance as well. I think he scored one against Liverpool that I remember. That was an amazing free kick that again I hadn't seen much of. And you have to remember the Premier League at this time. A lot of the foreign players who were coming to the league were towards the back end of their career, and at that time, talking that QPR Arsenal match, Ruud Gullit had come to the Premier League. Now he was a great player, but he wasn't at his peak in the Premier League. So there weren't as many top class foreign players as of course they are, and we're used to that now. We're used to some of the best players and most of the best players in the world ending up in the Premier League at some point. But it wasn't quite the case at the time. You would see the truly big stars were playing in Italy. So
Mhm.
again, that was a big part of it. And then teams like Barcelona and Real Madrid, as they always have been, really, always had that extra special star involved. And they were the ones with English football. It felt more about the personalities of people that you stuck to. I always remember Ian Wright, and I work with him now. Just
Mhm.
an amazing personality, great character, and I'm sure you'll agree as a Palace fan.
Of
And
course, of course.
of course, and but you'd have players from all over the league. I remember Neil Ruddock finding him really entertaining as a figure. Julian Dix, another one. It was just the personalities of the players felt just as important as their football at the time. Uh, and that's the thing. You didn't really care that the best players weren't playing in your league. Actually, you just enjoyed football for what it is. And I've always carried that with me, in that I can. Doesn't matter the level of football, I'll find something interesting in that game. I mean, did the FA Cup recently? Did Coventry against Maidstone? And you think the level, even between those two clubs, you could see the gulf in that match. But yet, it was still really fascinating researching Maidstone, speaking to the club, speaking to players at the club, um, getting into that. And again, it's just trying to get the personality. And it's harder for players now, of course, because they feel probably scared a bit to really let themselves show their true personalities, because for fear of, and we can say social media has played a big part in this, but for fear of a gotcha moment or something like that. But I could tell players in the mid '90s were not scared of that stuff at all, and the tabloids were rough as well, but they would
Yeah,
still that didn't seem to matter. Some of the things that players would, personality of players, actually going back to again that period, standing out, and it was sort of emotionally quite close to me as well. But Paul Merson coming out talking about his addiction. I think he'd gone to a clinic it had been revealed, and it was news at the time. And obviously, in the years that followed, several Arsenal players were talking about this. It was again, they felt, the players felt connected to you. You didn't know these people, weirdly, even though I know a lot of them now. You didn't know these people at the time, but you felt a connection with them, which you didn't really feel with anybody else, even musicians or movie stars that you liked at the time. You didn't have, it wasn't the same. The footballers, or as I said with in Frank Bruno's case, you just felt like they were part of your family or something. Very very bizarre, very bizarre concept, but that's how I felt.